If you look at Britain on a modern map, you'd assume it is just a small island nation off the coast of Europe. A green cluster of isles, with little to suggest global power. But appearances can be deceiving. Even today, Britain maintains 14 overseas territories scattered across the world, from Gibraltar at the entrance of the Mediterranean, to the windswept Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic, to tropical outposts in the Caribbean and Pacific. These territories are not accidents of geography. They are the final relics of an empire that once dominated the earth. At its peak, just over a century ago, the British Empire ruled 1/4 of the world's land surface and nearly 1/3 of its population. It was the empire so vast that the sun never set on it. But how did this small kingdom, often invaded itself, rise to command the greatest empire in history? And why did it eventually collapse? This is the story of the British Empire. Chapter 1. Before Empire. The seeds of empire were sown long before Britain even existed. For centuries, the dominant kingdom in the British Isles was England. England absorbed Wales during the medieval period and pushed into Ireland, often brutally. But to the north, Scotland remained fiercely independent, resisting repeated invasions. By the 1500s, England had developed a strong economy and navy. Under Queen Elizabeth I, the nation looked outward. Rival powers like Spain and Portugal were already establishing colonies across the globe. England could not afford to be left behind. Adventurers like Sir Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe, raiding Spanish ships and returning home with treasure. Sir Walter Raleigh attempted to build colonies in North America. The most famous attempt, Roanoke in 1585, ended in mystery when its settlers vanished without a trace. But Elizabeth understood something important. Empire required more than adventurers. She granted charters to trading companies like the Levant Company, 1592, and the East India Company, 1600. These corporations were given monopolies over trade routes, planting the seeds of what would become not just an empire of territory, but of commerce.
Chapter 2. Union of the Crowns. When Elizabeth died childless in 1603, the crown passed to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. For the first time, England and Scotland shared a monarch, though they remained separate states. James continued Elizabeth's policy of overseas expansion. Colonies were organized into 3 categories. Crown colonies, directly governed by the monarch's appointees. Charter colonies, where settlers had greater political liberties under royal charters. Proprietary colonies, run as commercial ventures by individuals or companies. At the same time, James pursued colonization closer to home. In Ireland, the plantation of Ulster saw thousands of English and Scottish Protestants forcibly settled on Irish land. This was more than conquest, it was a model of how Britain would later populate overseas colonies. Chapter 3. The First Empire. By the 1600s, Britain's focus turned firmly to the New World. Colonies sprang up along the North American coast, Virginia, Maryland, Massachusetts, and more. In the Caribbean, islands like Barbados and Jamaica became immensely profitable through sugar plantations. But these plantations relied on a system that would bring unimaginable suffering: the transatlantic slave trade. The Royal African Company, chartered in 1660, transported hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans to the Americas. Sugar, tobacco, and cotton fueled Britain's wealth, while human lives were treated as cargo. Scotland, eager to share in this prosperity, attempted its own colonies. All failed. The most disastrous was the Darien Scheme of 1698, where Scottish settlers tried to establish a colony in Panama to control trade between oceans. Within 2 years, disease, starvation, and Spanish attacks killed most of the settlers. The financial loss was catastrophic, plunging Scotland into crisis. The solution came in 1707 with the Acts of Union, which formally united England and Scotland as Great Britain. For Scotland, this meant access to England's colonial markets. For England, it meant a larger pool of manpower and resources for imperial expansion. Chapter 4. War and Expansion. The 18th century was a century of war, and war meant empire. Britain fought rival European powers across the globe. In North America, Britain gained territory from the French after the War of the Spanish Succession 1714. But the real breakthrough came during the 7 Years' War 1756 to 1763, sometimes called the First Global War. In India, the East India Company's forces defeated the French and local rulers at the Battle of Plassey in 1757, securing Bengal, one of the wealthiest regions in the world. In Canada, British forces captured Quebec, ending French ambitions in North America. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 gave Britain control of vast territories, Canada, Florida, and key Caribbean islands. Britain emerged as the dominant naval and colonial power of the age.
Chapter 5. The Loss of America, but power bred tension. In Britain's 13 colonies along the American coast, resentment grew over taxation without representation. Parliament imposed duties on paper, tea, and other goods, sparking protests and boycotts. In 1775, conflict broke out. A year later, the colonies declared independence, forming the United States of America. After 8 years of war, Britain was forced to accept defeat. The loss of America in 1783 was devastating, but it reshaped British strategy. Instead of turning west, Britain now looked east, toward Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. Chapter 6. Australia and the Pacific. After America, Britain needed a new destination for convicts. Captain James Cook's voyages in the 1770s provided the answer. He mapped New Zealand and the eastern coast of Australia, claiming them for Britain. In 1788, the first fleet of convicts arrived in New South Wales, beginning Australia's history as a penal colony. Over time, free settlers joined, and the colonies expanded inland. New Zealand was colonized in the mid-19th century, following treaties with the Maori people, though not without conflict. Chapter 7. The Napoleonic Wars and Naval Supremacy. The rise of Napoleon Bonaparte once again threatened Britain. The Royal Navy became Britain's shield and sword. At the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, Admiral Lord Nelson defeated the combined French and Spanish fleets, cementing British naval supremacy for more than a century. When the wars ended in 1815, Britain gained even more colonies: Malta, Mauritius, Trinidad, the Cape Colony, and Ceylon. With its navy controlling the seas, Britain could now project power anywhere on the globe. Chapter 8. Industry, Abolition, and India. The 19th century was Britain's imperial century. The Industrial Revolution transformed Britain into the workshop of the world. Textiles, coal, and iron poured from its factories, fueling demand for raw materials and markets abroad. At the same time, moral and political pressure ended Britain's involvement in the slave trade in 1807 and abolished slavery in the Empire in 1834. Yet empire continued to rely on systems of exploitation, from indentured laborers in the Caribbean to forced taxation in Africa. India, meanwhile, became the crown jewel. After the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857, Britain dissolved the East India Company and took direct control. India was not just a colony, it was the heart of the empire, supplying soldiers, raw materials, and prestige. Chapter 9. Rivalries and Africa. But Britain was not unchallenged. Russia pushed south into Central Asia, sparking the Great Game. To protect its interests, Britain occupied Egypt in 1882, securing the Suez Canal, the lifeline to India. In Africa, Britain expanded during the scramble for Africa, claiming territory from Cairo to Cape Town. Conflicts with local rulers and Boer settlers in South Africa were fierce, culminating in the Bloody Boer War 1899 to 1902. But by its end, Britain controlled much of southern and eastern Africa. Chapter 10. The World Wars and Decline. The First World War showed both the strength and fragility of empire. Over 2.5 million soldiers from colonies and dominions fought for Britain. Victorious, Britain gained new territories in the Middle East and Africa, but the war drained resources and inspired nationalist movements. World War II finished the job. Britain fought valiantly, but by 1945, it was bankrupt. The empire could no longer be sustained. India achieved independence in 1947, one by one. African, Asian, and Caribbean colonies followed. Chapter 11. The End of Empire. By the 1970s, the British Empire was gone. The final symbolic moment came in 1997, when Britain handed Hong Kong back to China. What remained was the Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association of former colonies. Chapter 12. Legacy. Though the empire ended, its impact endures. English is now the world's most widely spoken language. British legal, political, and educational systems have influenced countries across the globe, and modern Britain itself is shaped by its imperial past, a society of extraordinary diversity, with communities from every corner of the former empire. The rise and fall of the British Empire is a story of ambition, innovation, exploitation, and resilience. A small island nation that once ruled the world, and whose legacy, for better and for worse, still shapes our lives today.